Hello dear students and welcome to today's class. The topic of today's lecture is the agrarian economy in ancient Greece. There are certain objectives of the topic. We will be talking about the agrarian economy of ancient Greece. We will be able to understand the diverse crop patterns prevalent in ancient Greece and the extent of the people's expertise in the cultivation of various crops. To determine the extent to which the Greek economy was self-sufficient or dependent in the economies of the neighboring countries. Agriculture remained the cornerstone of city economies throughout the ancient past. As in many minimally mechanized rural cultures, agriculture in ancient Greece required a large labor force, especially during harvest and grape picking seasons, and it employed vast majority of the population, about 80%, in those agricultural pursuits. Agriculture supplied a significant amount of the raw materials used by the artisans and merchants. It influenced landscapes, communities, conventions and moods. Since citizens jointly and publicly owned the land and have always viewed property ownership as their more or less exclusive right, it has remained their domain par excellence throughout its history. They often even made political choices to offer land to the landless citizens. This was accomplished by subdividing existing plots or establishing colonies or kleurarchies, which means allocating parcels of land outside the city. Land ownership has historically been the foundation of the majority of significant fortunes. The work done on the land was more than any other economic activity, characterized by more ideals, conservatism and routine. It followed the regular pattern established by the passage of the seasons, holidays and rituals. Permanent worry, drought and diseases harming crops and livestock discouraged agricultural workers from taking risks in lieu of adhering to tried and true methods. Natural conditions virtually everywhere enforced the limitations of intensive dry agriculture, whose yields could only be enhanced by maximizing arable land exploitation and expanding the labor force. Despite shared characteristics, the world of agriculture was neither homogeneous nor stagnant. Soils and precipitation differed from region to region, prompting adaptations and other decisions. Agriculture and agricultural properties have changed and diversified over time. Until the 3rd century BCE, population and urbanization pressures caused towns to expand agricultural land. Some progress has been made in the processing of agricultural goods. Methods of cultivation, for example, they also improved as the classical period progressed, as is evidenced by the introduction of agronomy, botany and diet manuals, as well as the experiments in adapting new species to production in the Egyptian Fayoum around the 3rd century BCE. Now, we will be talking about some sources on agriculture. Despite the significance of agriculture, ancient textual materials depicting Greek agricultural practices are difficult to locate. Columella, a Roman agricultural author of the 1st century BCE, was aware of numerous Greek authors who had written on the subject, but almost all of their works have been destroyed. Works and Days, which is a text penned by a very important author whose name is Hesiod, composed this text approximately in around 700 BCE is regarded as one of the very important and oldest and most reliable historical sources. This poem gives useful information regarding the operation of an archaic Greek farm and the times of the year when specific duties were to be accomplished. Written more than 300 years later, Xenophon's Oikonomicus, which means the estate manager, is essentially a discourse between Socrates and a wealthy Athenian named Isomachus regarding the management of farmhouses. Isomachus discusses his methods with Socrates, who says that farming is the ideal career for an Athenian man, as farmers generate food and are the most willing and able to protect the city states. Theophrastus, a philosopher of the 4th century BCE, penned two botanical treatises with the name De Causis Plantarum, which means on the causes of plants, and Historia Plantarum, which means the history of plants, both of which include a wealth of helpful knowledge regarding the Greek agriculture. Theophrastus also authored a humorous, albeit stereotyped, little character analysis of the Greek farmer, whom he depicts as crude and ignorant. Theocritus, who was a poet from Syracuse, who lived in the 3rd century BCE, is credited with inventing pastoral poetry, which idealizes the rural life. Several of his Edlies have survived, typically depicting herders relaxing and singing in pastoral settings. From Greek estates in Ptolemaic Egypt, a new category of evidence has emerged, like accounts, books, and other records pertaining to the management of huge farms. Even though these manuscripts are frequently incomplete and difficult to decipher, they contain vital information about what was grown, who worked on the estates, and how much they were paid. The most important archaeological technique for studying ancient agriculture is known as the survey archaeology, in which a team of archaeologists goes over and studies vast expanses of land for surface remains of ancient activity. This method can disclose traces of historic farmhouses and communities, allowing archaeologists to construct a picture of land usage and settlement. Important information of Greek agriculture has been uncovered through the excavation of rural areas like farmhouses. Archaeologists have difficulty in researching Greek agriculture since many of the agricultural instruments were made of wood and therefore they have been lost. Now, talking about the agricultural labor and the products. Now, first we will be discussing in this subtitle the crops. Classic Mediterranean societies grew crops which consisted of cereals, vineyards, and olive trees. This trio has always predominated, but the Greeks also cultivated other crops, particularly legumes. Agricultural operations required continuous focus throughout the year. The climate of the Mediterranean determined their rhythm. Cereals were first cultivated during the Neolithic times, as we are aware. Now, wheat, which was known as pyros, and barley, which is known as krithia, were the two most prevalent cultivars. The Greeks grouped them together under the umbrella term sitos, which is more accurately rendered as cereals or grain than wheat. Soft wheat, the equivalent of our finest wheat, did existed, but hard wheat was far more prevalent. Wheat required better soil and higher humidity than barley, whose deeper roots allowed it to mature more quickly and produce superior crops. The most prevalent cultivar corresponds to modern winter barley. After the grain harvests which means from April through June, the land was typically left fallow for more than a year. When the spring rains subsided, the field was prepared by early ploughing. A plough or a hoe pushed into the soil, ripping up and burying weeds and stubble, which functioned as a green fertilizer. During the summer, further ploughing was done with a similar objective and to enrich the soil. After a preliminary ploughing that created furrows and a second ploughing that coated the seeds with soil, the first autumn rains heralded the sowing of seeds. The harrow did not show up until much later. The winter rains encouraged germination and the weeds were removed then. Barley was harvested in April and May, at least in the warmer parts, and wheat in May and June at the onset of the dry season. After the harvest, the grain was threshed, winnowed and stored. In addition to barley and wheat, 2 millet kinds were regularly farmed. Millet was sown in the spring and harvested in the summer. Numerous attempts have been made to estimate the yield of cereal production in Attica based on the limited data available, but these hypotheses are weak and conflicting, therefore they can't be taken in totality. Vine cultivation, which was later adopted, dates back to the Bronze Age. The vine could adapt to dry, stony soils, but it needs a lot of effort and attention. In September and October, the grape harvest began. To make a dry liqueur wine, Hesiod, his Works and Days, suggests that exposing grape bunches to the sun for 10 days and then keeping them in the shade for another 5 days. Crushing the grapes, then preparing and storing the wine and goods created from the marc and lees took months altogether. The task frequently continued far into the winter or even spring, when cuttings were trimmed and spaced, followed by ploughing and fertilizing the land. Until the Archaic period, we do not get proper evidences of the growth of the olive trees. Similar to vines, they flourished on thin soil. However, they took around 20 years to reach maturity and yielded fruit only once every 2 years. Olive trees could not grow in temperatures below 3 degrees centigrade or in powerful summer winds such as Meltemi, which blew from the north of the Aegean Sea. September and October were the earliest months for green olive harvesting. The crushing and pressing of olives began in November and lasted throughout the winter, as did the harvesting of mature olives. There was trimming to be done, and the soil was to be hoed and fertilized over the winter when there were no other obligations to the farmers. To foster fresh growth, old olive trees were pruned back to the stem. Vegetables and leguminous plants left fewer traces and only lately piqued the curiosity of scientists, yet they were more significant than previously supposed. Onions, celery, cabbages, cucumbers, leeks, turnips, fennel, horseradish, peas, beans, broad beans, veg, lentils, garlic and fragrant herbs were among them, while bay, sage, savory, mint, thyme, marjoram, rosemary, coriander and basil, etc. they grew wild. Green veggies had to be consumed quickly and were likely grown in gardens that could be irrigated. Other plants such as flax, sesame and poppies were grown for their seeds or oil. Some veggies and legumes matured over the cold season. Others like turnips, broad beans, chickpeas, lentils, veg, horseradish, flax, sesame and millet, sowed after April, would mature over the summer. Grass for hay, lupins, laburnum which bore nutritious leaves, alfalfa which seem to have been introduced from Persia in the 5th century BCE and was not commonly produced. Then leguminous plants like vetch, cereals including zay was fed to horses. In addition, the majority of farms like fruit orchards required time intensive maintenance. Apples, pears, cherries, plums, blackberries, melons, hazelnuts, pistachio, nuts and chestnuts etc. matured over the summer. Artisans also farmed or collected flax, willows, rushes, reeds and several species which were used for dyeing. Many of them were discovered and gathered in their spare time by women and children in forests, scrublands and marshes. The Greeks possessed few methods of soil fertilization. Animal dung was only available when animals were sheltered in stables or pastured on fallow land. In place of such manure, quick lime, saltpetre or leather scraps may be utilized. Farmers burned weeds and buried straw and grasses more frequently to serve as green fertilizer. The plants that grew on land were left fallow and the shrubs found on stony wastelands were used to create a type of compost. In order to avoid depleting the soil used for cultivation, the land was traditionally kept fallow every 2 years, allowing the soil to rest for 16 months. Such area might also be seeded with fodder plants which would then be plowed into the soil as green fertilizer. Less frequently, leguminous plants or summer fodder plant seeds were sown on the ground and set aside for cultivation that was out of the way. In addition, if the spaces between rows of grapevines or olive trees were large enough, gardeners planted cereals or legumes there in the gaps. Thus, agricultural practices varied very greatly throughout the ancient period. Now, coming to the pastoral agriculture. In addition to growing crops, we have information from different historical sources that the Greeks also practiced pastoral agriculture. In his Economics, Xenophon states that stock raising is linked to agriculture. The expression he uses, probe tut lai techne, which mainly means raising sheep and goats. Numerous texts and epigraphical sources mention not only those two species but also pigs, poultry, chickens and geese, cows, oxen, donkeys and mules, the last three being draft animals or beasts of burden, in addition to horses which were luxury mounts and horses used for hunting and warfare. The domestication of such creatures is as ancient as the agriculture in ancient Greece. Smaller animals, better adapted by inclusive diets to the Mediterranean vegetation, were far more numerous than the larger ones as they are today. It is not easy to estimate the importance of stock raising in comparison to agriculture or to see exactly how the two were linked. Alongside the indispensable beasts of burden and the draught animals, most farms probably also raised at least some poultry and smaller animals, which were pastured on stony wastelands in the woods or sometimes on land which was left fallow. In many cases, this kind of stock raising simply served to supplement the farm's produce. In others, where it was substantial and included cattle, there may have been veritable agro-pastoral farming. In the absence of informative sources, however, studies on the extent of combined farming remain at variance. Flocks inevitably posed the problem of how to feed them and how to grab the land for pasture and cultivation. However, with some exceptions, stock raising was always the less important activity. In certain regions, large herds of sheep and goats, cattle, and occasionally horses are attested. Often, herds of sheep and goats, which were more mobile and more adaptable, would be moved over relatively short distances between the mountains, where they spent the summer, and the plains where they remained for the winter season. Alternatively, they might spend a few months on a small deserted island also. Such transhumance is attested in particular by public conventions and agreements relating to the passage of flocks through neighboring cities or their temporary presence there, sometimes in return for tax payment. Inscriptions in Delphi and Delos, for example, show further that certain sanctuaries used their lands to raise animals. These are sometimes described as hera probata. At least some of them, like pigs, cattle, sheep, were probably destined for sacrifices. But such evidences are very rare. Of course, stock raising also provided supplies of milk, eggs, hides, and wool. Sheep shearing took place in the spring, and these commodities, after processing, produced cheese, leather, textiles, and even clothing. Both written sources and archaeological evidences reveal the existence of stables and sheep folds, which presupposes the cultivation of fodder plants. But since the climate made outdoor pasturage possible for much of the year, and many stables were used to house ploughing oxen, it is thus hard to calculate how many stables there were actually. The number certainly varied from one region to another region and also depended on such other factors as the need to protect crops and trees from the voracity of goats and the availability of grazing ground, which diminished as cultivated areas expanded. Now, we will be moving to another subheading, which is the cultivation of the soil, and we will be talking about different types of property and exploitation methods. During the Archaic period, some of the land in mainland Greece and the area around the Aegean was gradually given to all or at least most of the people who lived there. In principle, there was a clear link between owning land and being a citizen, even though some communities with less rights, like the Perioikoi of Sparta, kept their own land. In some cities, owning land was even a requirement for being a citizen. Each person's kaleros or piece of land was seen as a gift that could not be sold or given away even. It was passed down from father to son. Under the laws of Lycurgus, Sparta was one of these cities in the 5th century BCE. Here everyone owned a piece of land that was about the same size as that of his neighbors. Most of the other cities also passed laws about inheritance, adoption, and the sale of plots of land, but they were a bit strict. Plato and Aristotle both thought that one of the most important parts of an ideal city was a strict division of land among all the people who lived there, which should be carried on from one generation to the next. The concept of the citizen landowner, whether of modest or average means, remained a source of inspiration for generations and was realized in a number of situations. This kind of autogus, who worked on the land himself, could be found in almost every time, both in old cities where the land had already been divided and in the colonies or new cities where the land was divided equally. Nevertheless, few larger properties managed to survive. Some estimates say that in the 5th century, each of Attic's large estates was no bigger than 26 or 27 hectares and had 4 or 5 full-time workers. This may not seem like much to us now, but it would have been worth a lot of money back then. It is, however, certain that because of the problems of the time and changing social norms, large estates started up again after the 4th century, which went against the old idea that inheritances could not be sold. Attica wasn't as bad off as some other places in this way. At this time, it had a number of properties that were several dozen hectares, and some estimators say that 1/3 or 1/4 of its farmland may have belonged to no more than 2,000 people, which is less than 1/10 of the city's population. But this trend was even cleared in other places, especially in the Peloponnesus. From the 2nd century BCE onwards, it spread everywhere because at that time most cities were ruled by oligarchs whose wealth was mostly made up of the real estate. Rich landowners like these clearly gave stewards, who were often slaves, the job of running their estates. They also probably hired both free peasants and slaves to work on their land and livestock. In addition, there was a separate agricultural system in place. Additionally, to the mainland and the islands, it was practiced in the new towns established in Greece during the Archaic and Hellenistic periods. Indigenous people who lived in communities some distance from metropolitan areas farmed the land in this area. These settlements, which were collectively dependent on the cities, paid the landowners dues or tribute, typically a portion of their harvests. Sparta and Crete are the most well-known instances in which dependencies payments were utilized to provide common meals for the population. Some of these sites were likely hundreds of hectares in size. In Sparta, the typical size of a kaleros in the 5th century was between 10 and 18 hectares, or twice or 3 times even the size of the Athenian kaleros of the same period. In the following century, the situation in Sparta was even worse than in Athens as a result of the widespread acquisition of additional territory. Additionally, there were public and sacred estates. Literary and most importantly, epigraphical sources cite numerous instances of this. Athens, Thespae and the islands including Delos, Rhena, Mykonos, Thessos, Chios, Chios, Amorgos, as well as other cities in Caria and Lucanian Heraclea. Every city, regardless of size, seems to contain at least a couple of these estates. With this, we have come to the end of the lecture. I hope the details given in the lecture are up to mark to the topic which we were discussing in today's session. Thank you so much.